I never thought my own son and his wife would shove me through a glass door, but that's exactly what happened. Before we go any further, if my story has found you, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to see just how far my words can travel. The crash was sharp, the glass gave way, and suddenly I was on the ground, bleeding. They called it an accident. I sat alone in that cold kitchen, wondering if maybe I was useless now that I wasn't bringing home a paycheck. But what they never knew was that I'd quietly inherited $21 million. They thought I was broke. If they only knew I could buy and sell everything they own with cash. It was a Tuesday. Snow had just begun to fall, soft and steady, like the pause before something breaks. Ethan and Caroline had been tense all morning. I shrank into myself the way older women sometimes do when they sense they're no longer welcome. Caroline stood at the counter, arms crossed, her voice sharper than usual. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you?" She didn't have to yell, her tone cut clean enough. I glanced at her, then at Ethan, who didn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his phone, pretending he wasn't part of this, but he was. The house still had my name on it, and they didn't like that. I'd noticed the whispers, the missing mail, the locked drawers, but I kept quiet. I said calmly that I wasn't ready to sign anything, maybe we could talk after dinner. But Caroline stepped forward, pointed to the back door, and told me I needed some air, that I was emotional and should step outside. Her hand gripped my arm firm. Then something shifted. Ethan moved beside her. His hand brushed mine like he meant to help, but his jaw was tight. The next second I was falling. My back slammed into the glass. There was a loud crack, and then I was outside, half in the snow, half in shards. Cold bit my arms. Blood mingled with the bitter scent of pine. For a moment I thought I might not get up. But I did. Always do. From inside, Caroline called it an accident. Said I lost my balance. They didn't open the door. They didn't check on me. I stood, bleeding, my coat torn, shoes soaked. And in that stillness I saw it clearly for the first time. They wanted me gone. To them, I wasn't Ethan's mother anymore. I was a signature they needed to erase. I didn't go to the hospital. Instead, I walked to a little diner on Main and Willow, slid into the back booth, and ordered coffee with extra cream. The waitress didn't blink at the blood. She just handed me a napkin and said quietly, "Take your time." That night, while the snow kept falling, I rented a car and checked into a motel. My hands throbbed, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I wasn't going to scream or beg. I'd do what I've always done, watch, think, and move. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. But they'd forgotten who built this life from the ground up. Who made sure they never went hungry, covered their student loans, co-signed their mortgage. They forgot. I didn't. Some stories don't start with smiles or champagne. They start with broken glass and the heavy silence that follows. But silence, when you choose it, can be powerful. And mine was just beginning. Would you have walked away or stayed? Keep that answer in your own heart, because what happened next changed everything. I stayed at the motel for 3 nights. It wasn't the kind of place you'd brag about. Cold sheets, a ceiling fan ticking like an old clock. But it was quiet. And right then I needed quiet more than comfort. The morning after the glass incident, I woke early. My hand was swollen, but I cleaned and wrapped it again. I made a list, just 4 things, all simple, measurable things I could control. At the top was one word: proof. I've always trusted my instincts. Decades in boardrooms and mediation rooms taught me how to read people, to calm storms with the right words. But this wasn't work. This was my life, my son, my home. And somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred until I wasn't sure if I was living with family or among people waiting me out. Then I remembered something from months earlier, a quiet afternoon when Caroline had taken the kids to her mother's. I'd installed a small camera that day, nothing fancy, just a backup, tucked into the bookshelf corner, disguised as a ceramic owl. I told no one. I never thought I'd need it. Till now. I called an old friend, Lisa, once a colleague at the hospital network. She worked in compliance and tech security, sharp as a tack, and never asked unnecessary questions. Within hours, she pulled the footage and sent it to my private drive. I watched it once. Ethan's hands. Caroline's voice. The angle. The sound of my body hitting the glass. The break. Then silence. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't hurt feelings or a misunderstanding. It was assault. And they'd covered it with false concern while eyeing the house I paid off 27 years ago. The next day I called a lawyer, Sandra, a woman in her 50s with a voice like gravel over steel. She didn't want drama, only documentation. I gave her everything. While she began drafting a case for elder abuse and property coercion, I quietly moved my own plans forward. I went to the bank, withdrew enough to move fast but not raise alarms. Most of my money remained untouched, in municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and a separate account tied to an old client's trust. 21 million in total. I earned over years. Ethan had no idea. He thought my retirement came from a small pension and a bit of social security. Ethan always felt safe in his entitlement, assuming I had little more than a small pension. And Caroline? She never imagined I was anything beyond what she saw: gray hair, soft sweaters, quiet mornings. Easy to dismiss. But I'd been building something they never cared to notice. I rented a small apartment in town under another name. Month to month, no frills, no view, just space to think. The first thing I set on the counter was a plain black folder. Inside were the camera footage, a printed copy of the house deed, my living will, and Sandra's first draft of the complaint. I sat down, breathed in, and let myself feel it all. The betrayal, the humiliation, the ache of being treated as disposable by the very people I'd given everything to. And under that ache, a steady resolve began to grow. Not to punish, not to destroy, but to reclaim my name, my home, my dignity, my place in the world. This was only the beginning. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not from restlessness but from clarity. The apartment's quiet had its own comfort. The hum of the heater, faint traffic outside, the hollow sound of my slippers on the kitchen floor. I boiled water for tea and looked again at the folder. Nothing fancy, but everything inside carried weight. The first document was the deed. My name still there, no joint ownership, no transfer signatures. I'd trusted my gut for years and held off signing anything, and that instinct had saved me. The second was a ledger of my holdings, not for pride but for truth. Decades of steady investments in long-term care housing, hospital systems, wellness centers across 3 states. Clients had left me pieces in wills, trusts, or simple gratitude. I'd spent little. I'd never needed to. The third was a printed still from the footage. Me, hands in the air, the split second before the fall. Today I'd start filing paperwork with Sandra. But first I opened an old green notebook from my purse, its cloth cover worn soft at the edges. Inside were years of quiet notes, dates, conversations, small moments when I felt something was off. The mail sorted before it hit the table. Ethan insisting on handling the utility bills I'd always paid. Caroline's casual, calculated questions about who'd inherit the house, or if I'd updated my will. Missing papers, social security statements, a bank envelope. I remembered asking once if my Medicare card had arrived. Caroline had waved me off, saying she'd put it somewhere safe. I never saw it again. Standing in that little apartment kitchen, I knew I hadn't been paranoid. I'd been preparing. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were planning for me to vanish quietly, without fuss, without questions. I sipped my tea and watched the snow return. Fine, steady, settling on rooftops like dust on forgotten shelves. After breakfast, I dressed with intention, not vanity. Gray trousers, black turtleneck, wool coat. The same one I wore when I signed my first leadership contract at the hospital in 1984. That coat had been in more boardrooms than most junior partners would see in a lifetime. At exactly 10 a.m. I carried the folder into Sandra's office. Her assistant, a brisk young woman with short hair and clipped sentences, led me into a room lined with legal binders and framed citations. Sandra sat behind a spotless desk. No photos, no clutter, just a pen and a yellow legal pad. She skipped small talk, opened the folder, reviewed every page and nodded. In under half an hour she confirmed what I already knew. I had a case, not just for assault but for financial manipulation, coercion, and willful neglect of a dependent elder. Colorado's elder abuse laws were clear, and Sandra had handled cases like this before. Quietly, without media, but firmly. I asked her to keep everything sealed for now. I wasn't looking for headlines. I wanted resolution. She agreed. We'd move slowly but deliberately. By noon I'd signed the preliminary affidavit. By 3, copies of the footage were secured in 2 locations. By sundown I was back at my apartment, the folder thinner but heavier in weight. It might take weeks before charges were filed, longer before court. But the motion had begun, and once it starts there's no undoing it. That night I barely slept. My body ached, my injured hand still trembled, but I no longer felt small or invisible. My family no longer saw me clearly. To them, I was an obstacle, a liability, a delay. But they didn't know I'd already moved the funds into a separate holding company, updated the trust to remove all heirs, and shielded the house title inside a revocable trust. Most of all, they didn't know the woman they tried to erase had already written the next chapter, without them. 3 days after meeting with Sandra, she called just after 8 a.m. Her voice was calm. The paperwork was filed, the complaint officially entered into the court system. "Don't expect drama right away," she said. "These things take time." I simply thanked her, hung up, and stood in my small kitchen, letting silence speak louder than words. That afternoon, I drove to a private postal center on the edge of town. I dropped off a pre-sealed envelope at the private postal center. Inside were 3 things: a copy of the complaint, a lawyer's letter demanding the return of all house-related documents, and a notice of restricted contact, effective immediately. The address was Ethan and Caroline's. I didn't linger. I didn't look back. By the time I returned to my apartment, the snow had grown heavier, pressing down on everything, muffling the world like a lid on a pot building pressure. I sat by the window and opened my notebook. Flipping to old entries, I saw the small notes I'd once dismissed now lined up like a blueprint. Caroline accidentally signing for my medical statements 4 months ago. Ethan offering to update the property tax info last winter. The new phone plan they insisted would save me money, except it locked me out of my banking app for 2 weeks. Subtle. Calculated. That day I made a new list, not of what I'd lost but what I still fully controlled. The deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and most important, myself. The next morning, Sandra emailed a case update. The court had set a preliminary review date. Nothing public yet, no arrests. But if things moved as expected, the footage would be direct evidence and a temporary restraining order could follow. I didn't celebrate, but something inside me aligned. Later that week, I met with Marcus, an estate planner I'd trusted years ago during the restructuring of a client's retirement portfolio. He was discreet, reliable, still treating me as if I carried the hospital title I'd left over a decade ago. I told him to prepare documents to shift most of my holdings into a new foundation, a non-profit trust to support career retraining and wellness resources for women over 60, especially widows, especially those discarded by family once they were no longer needed. Marcus didn't blink. He asked sharp questions, mapped out timelines, told me what to move now and what to delay. I left with a binder of drafts and a quiet plan. The streets were slick that afternoon. People walked carefully. I moved slowly too, not from fatigue but because I could. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to prove anything. That night, I pulled out old photo albums not for nostalgia but for truth. I wanted to see the moments I'd forgotten, the smiles that were real, the holidays where warmth wasn't rehearsed. One picture stopped me, Ethan at 12 sitting beside me on the hospital lawn, eating a sandwich I'd packed. His hair messy, his arm looped around my shoulder. He wasn't cruel then, just a boy with too much feeling and nowhere to put it. I held that photo a long time, not to excuse but to remember where we started so I could fully see where we'd ended up. A few days later, Caroline left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, professional. They'd received my lawyer's letter, she said, and they were surprised by the accusations. Caroline's voicemail ended with, "I hope we can resolve this privately." No apology, no regret, just control. She sounded more worried about the paper trail than the glass still embedded in the coat I'd kept folded in a sealed bag. I didn't respond. Sandra would handle all contact from now on. I wasn't going to argue or explain. Said I prepared. I made copies of every document and stored them in 3 different places. I set another meeting with Marcus to finalize the first transfer of funds. I bought a new gray wool coat, heavy and built for cold days. The old one, stained with my blood, marked the line between before and after. The wind was sharp during my walk, but I didn't flinch. My body had adjusted to discomfort. My mind was clearer than ever. They thought pushing me through glass would shatter me. What they didn't realize was that some glass breaks clean, and the woman standing on the other side can come out sharper. Now I had precision, paperwork, patience, and the law. The apartment grew quieter as the week passed. Snow piled high on the ledge, swallowing the outside noise. Each morning the rhythm was the same. Tea, documents, walking. A silent ritual that kept me sharp without letting me slip into sadness. On the 5th morning I drove west into the mountains without telling anyone. Not even Sandra. I left at sunrise with a small bag and my new coat, checking into a cabin in Aspen under another name, just as I used to arrange for high-profile hospital staff who needed discretion. The road wound through pines and frozen lakes under a heavy gray sky. When I arrived near noon, the snow was thick and untouched, the air cleaner than anything I'd breathed in weeks. The cabin was simple: fireplace, a view of the slope, a kitchen I wouldn't use. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there to breathe in silence and remember who I was before the noise began. That evening I soaked in the outdoor pool, the water hot against the winter air. I stayed under longer than usual, emptying myself to make room. The next morning I sat on the deck wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee, thinking about the woman I'd been, the one who made excuses for Ethan's treatment of me. Maybe he's stressed. Maybe he's protecting Caroline. Maybe I misunderstood. I stopped making excuses the day my back hit glass. Now I looked back with sharper eyes, making new outlines, not for court, but for the life I'd live without explaining myself to anyone. Later, I wandered into town and visited a small bookstore I'd loved years ago. Ruth, the owner, still remembered me. We didn't talk much. I bought a few books about quiet women who changed their lives late, then left without mentioning who I was. I didn't need to be the woman with the folder, not today. By the third day, the cabin felt like mine, not because I owned it but because I'd brought myself there by choice. There's a quiet power in reclaiming space, even if it's only for a while. It's the difference between running away and truly returning. That night I wrote letters, not to Ethan, not to Caroline, but to myself. To the me at 40 who spent birthdays alone because family forgot. To the me at 50 who helped them buy their first house but wasn't invited to the housewarming. To the me at 60 who quietly paid off their credit card debt when they couldn't make the minimum. I told each of those women they did the best they could with what they knew. I forgave them. Thanked them. Without them I wouldn't be here, strong enough to walk away, smart enough to plan ahead, patient enough to let the truth do the work. That night the snow turned violent. Wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass, reminding me how fragile walls can be. But the fire stayed lit and the roof held strong. I didn't feel unsafe. I felt awake. In the morning I checked out early. The road home was slick and steep, but I didn't rush. At every turn I thought about what came next. Sandra would be preparing the next filing. Caroline would likely respond with charm or outrage. Ethan would go quiet, then passive, then resentful, like always. But I wasn't going back into that house or into the old version of myself. Instead, I drove straight to the building housing my newly registered foundation. The paperwork had been finalized 2 days earlier. I hadn't told anyone, not even Marcus. It was my private beginning. I handed my ID to the receptionist and smiled when she read the name aloud. I asked her to say it again. The Montreux Initiative, a place for women over 60 to rebuild quietly, powerfully, on their own terms. She gave me the welcome packet and I walked into the small office reserved for me. No applause, no ceremony, but something real shifted inside. Ethan once told me I was too sensitive, that I took things too personally. Now I took things personally on purpose, not from pain but from clarity. Sometimes after the snow settles, you realize the path wasn't gone. It was just covered. And now I was walking it alone. The first time I saw Caroline again wasn't in a courtroom or on the phone. It was at a property showcase. I hadn't planned it, but life has its own rhythm when you stop forcing the tempo. Her firm was hosting a tour of renovated homes outside Denver. One was a minimalist 5-bedroom ranch with Scandinavian interiors, funded by a private investment group. What she didn't know was that the group had recently come under new management. Quietly, discreetly. That management was me. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing dark sunglasses and a long coat. Not to hide, just to move without drawing attention. I toured the house like any other guest, listening to Caroline's polished voice as she highlighted the imported tile, the underfloor heating, the solar rebates. She looked the same, perfect hair, steady tone, that overly gracious manner she always used when selling something. I watched her charm a younger couple over the upgraded kitchen, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When she turned and saw me, her expression faltered for a heartbeat before settling back into composure. She didn't know whether to acknowledge me. I didn't give her the chance. I wandered into the master bedroom, running my fingers along the cedar-scented windowsill. Everything was staged. Nothing felt lived in, just like their marriage. Chloe, her assistant, followed me in. I remembered seeing her once at a family event when she was new to Caroline's team. Now she wore a sharp suit and carried a clipboard. Clearing her throat, she told me, more arrogantly than necessary, that this was a private showing. I turned slowly, met her eyes, and handed her a business card from the investment firm. My name appeared under Strategic Partner. She read it, blinked, and muttered something about checking with Caroline. I told her to take her time, I'd be in the sunroom. 10 minutes later, Caroline entered. No greeting, no questions. She glanced at the card in Chloe's hand, then at me. I saw the panic under her calm. I asked if she'd reviewed the latest sponsorship ledger. She didn't answer, she didn't have to. The firm she worked for had taken a bridge loan from a group of silent backers for this renovation. When I took over management of the fund, I became one of those silent partners. Not for control but for positioning. Her posture stiffened, her eyes calculated. She knew this wasn't chance. I told her every decision leaves a paper trail, and all trails eventually lead home. Then I left. No confrontation, no need. The point wasn't drama. It was to remind her she'd underestimated the wrong woman. That evening, I sat in a small cafe outside the city, sipping black tea as the sky deepened to purple. A young waitress asked if I needed anything else. I smiled. No, thank you. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Later that night, I checked my email. Sandra had forwarded new court correspondence. The case had moved from preliminary review to active motion. Interviews, depositions, hearings if necessary. She also included a sealed evidence list. The footage, sworn statements from 2 neighbors who heard the argument, and records of Ethan's attempts to transfer my utility bills into his name. Slow progress but steady. That same week, I got confirmation from the bank. The Montreux Initiative's trust paperwork was finalized. The first transfer, $5 million, was in place for operations and long-term endowments. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I wondered what Caroline told Ethan after the showcase. Whether she softened it or told him everything. I'd never know. That part wasn't mine anymore. What mattered was the ground beneath them had started to shift, and I was no longer standing still. I didn't hear from Ethan directly. For a man who once inserted himself into every decision I made, his silence spoke volumes. Caroline, though, couldn't help herself. Less than a week after the showcase, Sandra forwarded me an email from her legal team, polished, careful, calling the conflict a misunderstanding and an emotional misjudgment. They wanted a private resolution, mutual agreements, and the immediate withdrawal of all motions. In other words, a deal. I didn't reply. Sandra did. Her message was short. The process would continue and no commentary would be made outside official channels. The chain ended there. Later that day, Marcus called. His voice had a tension I'd never heard from him before. A third-party real estate group had inquired about ownership verification on one of my trust's parcels. Someone was testing for weaknesses. I asked what he needed. He told me nothing. The documents had been reinforced months ago when we restructured. It was handled. Still, he wanted me to know. I wasn't surprised. I'd expected pushback, but this felt different. Desperation disguised as strategy. That evening, I pulled out an old list of properties Ethan once asked me to co-sign for, back when they were still building their business. I'd declined politely then, uneasy with how he framed it as my duty as a mother. At the time, I didn't know why it felt wrong. Now I knew it was instinct. Quiet, stubborn instinct. The next morning, Sandra emailed again. Discovery was closing. The court had approved the next step, a pre-motion hearing. With it would come the release of evidence to both sides. The footage would no longer be a quiet file on a private drive. It would be part of the record. That afternoon, I walked through the local arboretum. The paths were icy, the benches cold, but it felt good to move while everything else seemed frozen in place. I thought about the last Christmas in that house. Caroline ordering catering, Ethan barely speaking to me, the grandkids glued to their tablets, ignoring the gifts I'd chosen for them. I remembered hanging a glass ornament on the tree and seeing my reflection warped in the silver. I didn't know then it would be the last time I'd sit at that table. Looking back, I was glad I hadn't known that last Christmas would be my final one in that house, because guilt might have kept me there too long. And guilt is no reason to keep bleeding. Later that week, the court set a hearing for 2 weeks out. No cameras, no audience, just a judge, a few attorneys and documents. Still, It would be the moment the truth began to live outside my own head. Meanwhile, I kept moving. I met with the foundation's first advisors, women from across the state. Some had lost their husbands, others their homes, but all had been overlooked. Listening to them, I realized that for all the silence I'd endured in that house, I hadn't lost my voice. I'd just been speaking to the wrong people. After the meeting, one woman approached me. Janice, soft eyes, steady voice, said she'd noticed how I listened. Not just to respond, she told me, but to hold space, to make room for someone else's truth. It was the kindest thing I'd heard in years. That night, I pulled out the same folder I'd kept from the start. Medical records, financial files, trust documents, and the hard drive with the video. I placed it in the new fireproof safe I'd installed last week. It was no longer just protection. It was preparation. The house Ethan and Caroline had tried to control was slipping from their hands. The bank froze their line of credit. The mortgage was flagged. Everything beneath them was starting to crack, and they had no idea how still I'd become. Stillness, I'd learned, isn't weakness. It's waiting with intention. And I was done waiting. Sandra's call came on a quiet Thursday. Her voice carried weight. The house, my former house, was officially under investigation. The footage had been reviewed not just by the court, but by a special division for elder abuse. They were taking it seriously. There would be a site visit, officers coming to collect evidence and walk the ground where it happened. Caroline had called the court first that morning, apparently frantic. I didn't feel relief, just stillness, like watching the first crack spread across a frozen pond. I didn't ask for details. Sandra said to stay steady. No contact, no sudden moves. The process was working. Later, I sat at my dining table, fingers resting on a teacup, watching sunlight break through weeks of cold. I let it warm my face through the window. That afternoon, a message came from an unfamiliar number. Short, no greeting. Your neighbors are talking. What are you doing to us? No name, but I knew Ethan's number. Ethan hadn't spoken to me in months. Not since the night he pushed me, not since my blood seeped into the floorboards of a house he no longer controlled. I didn't respond to his message. I passed it to Sandra, who flagged it for documentation. That evening, I walked through the city, past the courthouse, past a legal office that had once turned me away when I arrived with only a bruised wrist and a trembling voice. They hadn't even offered a consultation, just the number to a hotline. Now I passed without bitterness. I had Sandra. I had a file thick as a novel. I had official attention. At home, I reviewed my timeline. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I needed to remember the patience it took for truth to form. The fall. The silence. The hospital. The apology that never came. The first email to Sandra. The footage transfer. The quiet filing. The letter. The pushback. The showcase. The sunroom. Marcus's call. The trust established. The hearing set. And now the site visit. None of it happened overnight, but together it built something undeniable. The next morning, word came that officers had been to the house. They'd spoken to neighbors. Mrs. Kendall, 2 doors down, had given a sworn statement. She'd seen me leave that night with a torn coat and blood on my sleeve. She'd stayed silent out of fear of disrupting the neighborhood, but the footage had changed that. It was no longer opinion, it was fact. Sandra told me there was talk in the court about charging Ethan and Caroline not just with assault, but with endangerment and intentional concealment of evidence. They'd waited too long to call it an accident. They'd worked too hard to cover it. That weekend, I visited the foundation office again. A new ivory plaque with raised silver letters now hung on the wall. The Montreux Initiative. A young woman at the door, just 23, interning while earning her nursing degree, smiled brightly and offered me a tour, not knowing who I was. I told her I'd walk alone. I moved slowly, room by room, past shelves of books, boxes of supplies for rural libraries and senior centers, stacks of grant applications from women who had been silent too long. I lingered in the conference room, ran my hand along the table and sat for a moment looking out the window. A life can seem ordinary on paper, but the decisions that shape it arrive quietly, without ceremony, like sitting in a courtroom as a witness, hearing your son's name read in legal tone, knowing you didn't raise your voice but you raised the truth. As I left, the sun slipped behind the trees. Driving home, Sandra called again. The county clerk had received a sealed filing from Caroline's attorney. A request for early mediation, voluntary and private. A last attempt to avoid formal charges. It meant only one thing: they knew what was coming and they were afraid. I pulled over, rolled the window down, and let the cold sting my face. I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake, alive, unbroken. The court date was quiet. No cameras, no crowd, just a second-floor courtroom in the county building, its windows looking out at bare gray trees. The air smelled faintly of old carpet and paperwork. I arrived 10 minutes early in navy slacks, a dark sweater, and my late husband's watch. Not for comfort, but to remind myself of the years I'd held everything together for others. Today wasn't about memory. It was about ownership. Sandra was already at the table, her briefcase open, papers laid out in perfect rows. She glanced up, gave a small nod, and returned to her notes. Across the aisle, Ethan sat stiff beside his lawyer. His suit didn't fit, maybe borrowed, maybe just no longer his. His eyes flicked toward me, then dropped to the table. Caroline arrived 3 minutes later, dressed in black, no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. She didn't sit beside him, taking the row behind, arms crossed tight. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a voice like dry wood snapping, entered without lingering on anyone. She read from the file, called the room to order, and began. The clerk read the charges: misdemeanor elder abuse, obstruction of reporting, and attempted coercion of property through emotional manipulation. 3 charges, each followed by a pause that seemed to stretch. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't need to. Sandra presented the footage next. A monitor faced the bench. No sound, just the video. I'd only watched it once, alone in a motel room. Now I watched without flinching. Ethan's arm reached across the frame. My body staggered back. The glass shattered. I vanished from view. Silence. The video ended. No gasp in the room, just stillness. Even the judge paused before writing something down and signaling to continue. Sandra kept her statement brief. Facts only. My injury. The delay in reporting. The intimidation attempts. Documentation of asset transfers Ethan had tried weeks before the incident. A pattern, subtle but clear. His attorney countered with deflection. Stress, miscommunication, a family argument taken out of context. A moment of unintentional harm. A son pushed too far. Then Caroline was asked if she wished to speak. Her lawyer leaned in. She shook her head. No words. Her silence was the loudest thing she had ever said to me. The judge didn't take long. This wasn't sentencing, just the evidentiary hearing, but she ruled the case would proceed to full review. The evidence warranted further action. My protective order was extended. Ethan was barred from contacting me in any form. Caroline too. Financial access frozen. Shared accounts under audit. The investigation would widen. When the gavel fell, I didn't exhale. I stood, nodded to Sandra, and left without looking back. Outside, wind scraped leaves across the sidewalk like dry whispers. I walked slowly. Every step felt earned. At a nearby cafe, I ordered a small black coffee and sat in the corner. No one recognized me. I opened my notebook, drew a line through today's date, and wrote one sentence. I am not broken. That evening, a letter waited for me, handwritten, plain envelope. It was from Ethan. The handwriting shook. He said he was sorry. Said he'd been under pressure. Said he didn't expect it to go this far. Asked me to remember the boy he once was. I read it twice, then folded it into a drawer I rarely opened. Not out of bitterness, but because forgiveness is a process, not a performance. That night, I sat in the dark by the window. I didn't cry or smile, just let the quiet hold its weight. The house was mine again. The deed corrected. The will updated. The foundation had gained non-profit status. Our first board meeting was set in 2 weeks. There were lives I would help change, not out of revenge but because I could. And that was power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that builds. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, the letter tucked away. I hadn't touched it since, though I'd thought about it. Not the words he wrote, but the ones he didn't. For years I kept my tongue. Shrunk into corners. Let them speak over me, correct me, dismiss me with soft smiles. Not because I didn't know better, but because I thought love meant choosing peace over pride. That day in court, when he couldn't meet my eyes, I understood. I'd given too much. I'd raised a son on fear. Not loud fear, but the kind that whispers, don't push too hard. Don't expect too much. Don't disappoint. And now I saw that child in the man. A man who believed guilt could be brushed aside, that apologies were enough, that forgiveness was automatic. I stood at the window. Snow was falling again. The city never truly stopped moving, but its rhythm felt calm. I breathed deeply. The tightness in my chest was gone. The next morning, I attended a community roundtable hosted by the foundation. We met in a rented hall at a library branch outside Denver. Dozens of women came, some alone, some with daughters, some carrying notebooks full of dreams they'd put aside for decades. I watched them speak, hesitant at first, then stronger as their words met nodding heads and understanding eyes. There was something holy in the way they listened to one another. No judgment, just shared ache and quiet recognition. During a break, a woman named Felicia sat beside me. 65, recently divorced. Her son had moved away, barely called. Her eyes were kind but tired. She told me she used to think invisibility was just part of aging, that it was normal. Now she wasn't so sure. I told her I'd once mistaken silence for strength too, that I'd believed not asking for anything was a virtue. She smiled and said, "Then maybe it's time we rewrite what strength looks like." That evening, walking to my car, I passed a small bookstore. A sign in the window read, "Local authors reading, next Saturday." I smiled and kept going. It wasn't about being seen. It was about finally seeing myself clearly. At home, I made tea and opened a blank notebook. I didn't plan to journal, just wanted to feel paper again. It reminded me of when I wrote notes for Ethan's school lunches. "You've got this. I believe in you. You're stronger than you think." Now I was writing those words to myself. The next morning, Marcus called. The final audits were back. Every attempt Ethan and Caroline had made to touch my assets had failed. Fraudulent requests, disguised inquiries, manipulative paperwork filed days before the incident. All documented, all blocked, all traceable. His voice carried quiet pride. Then he told me something unexpected. A law student under his mentorship wanted to take the case further, not for harsher punishment but for precedent. The footage, the documented pattern, the silence. It painted a picture of systemic elder abuse too often unseen. He wanted to write about it, raise awareness. I agreed, not for my own story but so others would know they weren't alone. That same week, Caroline's name was removed from 2 properties she tried to leverage. The bank reversed the transfers. She had no legal claim. Ethan's accounts remained frozen. A review hearing for financial restitution was set. And yet I felt no triumph. I didn't need it. What I felt was a quiet clearing, a path no longer tangled with confusion or dread. That weekend I returned to Aspen. I walked the same trails I'd found months ago when I'd fled the chaos, unsure what came next. This time I walked not as someone escaping but as someone returning. Near sunset I stopped at the ridge overlooking the valley. Closing my eyes I thought of that night. The glass, the silence, the ache in my chest as I waited for an apology that never came. And I whispered softly, not to him but to myself, "You didn't deserve that." Not the push, not the neglect, not the years of being talked over, looked past, used only when convenient. Not the assumption that I'd always be there, always say yes, always stay small. I didn't deserve any of it and I survived anyway. That night I slept without waking once. The first full sleep in years. No memories chasing me. No whispers of what I could have done differently. Just rest. Just breath. Just peace. It was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming the voice I'd buried under years of quiet. And now that I had it back, I wasn't letting it go. That Monday, as snow began to fall again, I walked into the Montreux Initiative's office. The walls now held framed photographs. Smiling faces, graduation certificates, business licenses, letters from daughters who'd watched their mothers rebuild. In the main room, our new coordinator was setting up for a workshop. She nodded and kept working. That small moment felt like something I never thought I'd have again. I wasn't being handled, just respected as another person doing the work. In the founder's room, I opened a drawer and took out the sealed packet I'd held for months. Inside was the final transfer of my remaining assets, $21 million, into the trust. Signed, sealed, legally untouchable. Not for tax protection or image, but so the money would outlive me without carrying blood or guilt. The statement listed one permanent use: empowerment of older women in transition. I signed the last page slowly, like saying goodbye to the version of me afraid of her own worth. That evening I drove by the old house one last time. The new owners, a retired couple from Oregon, knew nothing of Ethan or Caroline. They'd simply been told the sale took time. The porch light was on, wind chimes swayed under the eaves. The new glass door had replaced the one I'd gone through, though the frame still bore a faint scar. I didn't need to walk up. I'd already reclaimed what mattered. As I turned to leave, Sandra texted, "The final judgment was in. Ethan. 5 years of restricted financial access and mandatory counseling for abusive behavior toward vulnerable adults. Caroline. Settlement signed, claims relinquished, appeal withdrawn. No trial. Just signatures and silence." And now I had. And if my story stayed with you, tap that like button and subscribe. It lets me know you're here and it helps this story reach the people who might need it most.